Hello, this is Doug MacDonald again from the Department of Anthropology. I'm your instructor professor for the Anthropology 451 Cultural Resource Management class. This is week 2, the history of cultural resource management, and we're going to go through a chronology of the important historic preservation laws issued by the federal government over the last 100 or so years. We're then, as part of that process, going to review the key laws that we're going to study in this class. And don't forget that during week 2, at the end of the week, you have. So, Anthropology 451, Cultural Resource Management, will study the key laws that facilitate management of cultural resources in the United States. What are the 4 types of cultural resources? That was a question from last week. Think about that as you think about the lecture for today, and that'll be certainly a question that'll be on the quiz. Why do we do cultural resource management? What requires us to actually take into consideration cultural resources? What are the 4 main laws that we'll study? We'll review all these things today as we go through the history of the United States cultural resource management. So in terms of the history of the cultural resource management in the United States, there's 2 main periods of time. The first is called the preservation period from 1800 to 1960. The second is called the legislative period from 1960 to 2006. It even continues into today. So the preservation period basically started in 1800. There was a feeling across the United States during the 19th century as the United States was established as a nation after the Revolutionary War, as the United States became more stable in terms of its government, that we needed to started to record its history. Therefore, the Library of Congress was preserved. That's largely looked at as the first instance of historic preservation in terms of the keeping of documents, so to speak, in 1800. There was a restoration of the old Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia in 1813, so that's sort of the first instance of historic preservation regarding an historic building in the United States. In 1857, the Smithsonian Institution and the Bureau of American Ethnology, the BAE, were established. That was to provide a federal institution that could preserve artifacts of importance to the United States government and to the United States people. So, if you go to Washington, D.C. today and go to the Smithsonian, there's all kinds of artifacts and objects that have been important in the history. So this can be looked at as one of those early instances of historic preservation, creating this mindset of history in the United States. In 1858, George Washington's house in Virginia, Mount Vernon, was restored by a private organization, a ladies' association in that region, and that was the first instance of a private entity stepping forward to fund and preserve a important historic place in the United States. Obviously today we have lots of private organizations that step forward and preserve historic buildings, so private entities have become an important part of historic preservation in the United States as well. In 1887, the first archaeological site was purchased by the United States government, and what this said was that the Native American archaeological sites were important for United States history as well. The Bureau of American Ethnology, led by Cyrus Thompson, debunked a myth that the mounds were created by all kinds of other people but Native American people in the United States. In the Midwest, there's a group of archaeological sites called mounds that Native Americans built about 2,000 years ago, places like Ohio, Mississippi, central United States. Anyway, there was a myth that the Native American people could not have possibly built those mounds, and that was debunked. So that's just an instance of historical preservation in terms of accuracy of interpretation of the historical record. In 1889, Casa Grande was acquired, and in 1892 it was declared the first archaeological reserve. Since that time, it's been established as a national monument. So again, just saying that it's not just historic buildings that are important, but archaeological sites, and all these sorts of things are going to be reflected in the establishment of the key laws as well. In the 1880s, the Wetherill brothers and the Hyde brothers, the Wetherill family, excavated Chaco Canyon in Arizona, New Mexico. In that Four Corners region, we have lots of illicit archaeology by non-professional people that led to this idea that were these people actually archaeologists, or were they pot hunters trying to sell objects to museums to make a profit off of these important Native American archaeological sites. So essentially what happened was that the United States government stepped forward, and in their stepping forward, they established what became as the first federal government law regarding cultural resources. In 1906, this was the Antiquities Act. This was the first federal preservation law passed by the United States government. It was spearheaded by a New Mexico Congressman, Edgar Hewitt, and it also led to the establishment of America's first national monument, which is Devil's Tower in 1906. So to this day, the Antiquities Act is on the books as a federal law preserving historic resources. It doesn't quite have the same impact today as it did back in 1906 for reasons that we'll talk about later in this lecture. But it is important, especially in the sense that it does protect Native American sites on federal land. It also requires permits for excavators, so all those archaeologists or pseudo-archaeologists that were excavating at Chaco Canyon now needed to get a permit issued by the federal government. These days, the Antiquities Act is actually used by most presidents to establish national monuments, again, such as Devil's Tower. But essentially what it did was establish a precedent for the United States government to be a preservation agent, meaning that they could establish federal laws to protect cultural resources. In 1916, the National Park Service was founded. In 1926, Williamsburg became an important historical tourism spot, meaning that the United States as a general public was interested in seeing history. The city of Charleston did a similar thing in establishing a local historic district in terms of preserving the historic architectural qualities. In the 1930s, just after and during the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt established the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. A lot of money was put into excavation of archaeological sites. In Montana, the Hagen and Pictograph Cave sites were two of the sites that were excavated with funding from the WPA. In 1935, the Historic Sites Act was passed. This formalized the role of the National Park Service as a historic preservation agent, basically established the National Park Service as the federal agency responsible for historic preservation rules. It established HAB's HARE, which is important for historic architecture. It's the Historic American Bridge Survey and the Historic American Engineering Record, HAB's HARE. It's used to this day to record important historic resources. It established an advisory board of historic preservation. It also established an historic landmarks list. After World War II, we saw a lot of suburban and city development leading to the destruction of resources. That led to a variety of laws, including the Reservoir Salvage Act of 1960. So lots of dams were being constructed. This led to the destruction of archaeological sites. The Department of Transportation Act, Section 4F in 1966, which is still an important cultural resource law that we'll talk about. Arguably the most important cultural resource law in the class was passed also in 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act. That established the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and I would say that we're going to spend at least 50% of this entire class using the National Historic Preservation Act, or the NHPA. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, is also a law very much used in today's government environmental consideration during projects. And in 1972, President Richard Nixon passed Executive Order 11593. That meant that federal agencies had to determine the effects of all of their federal projects on National Register listed properties or properties that were eligible for listing on the National Register. And I'll explain later in the class as to why that executive order was so important. The Archaeological Data and Historic Preservation Act 1974, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, the Archaeological Resource Protection Act in 1979 is important because it was an update of the Antiquities Act of 1906. Basically, the Antiquities Act in 1906 didn't provide enough protections for archaeological sites, fines and penalties. The Archaeological Resource Protection Act, or ARPA, in 1979 strengthened those laws, so both the Antiquities Act and ARPA are still on the books. The NHP regulations have been updated multiple times over the course of the last 20, 30, 40 years. Abandoned Shipwrecked Act, National Register Bulletin 38, established in 1990 traditional cultural places as an important cultural resource. In 1990, a very important law, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Law, was passed. Various other parts of the National Historic Preservation Act were established in 1992, 1999, 2004. And again, this is a figure from Tom King's book, and it summarizes all of the key federal laws that we're going to talk about in this class. And on top of that, there's state and local laws regarding cultural resources, as well as tribal laws that we won't get into as much. This is a list of acronyms that I've used in this lecture and that you've probably seen in Tom King's book, and we will use all these over the course of the semester. You can bet that you'll see some of these on quiz number 1. This is posted on Moodle as an acronym list. Don't forget, in week 3 for next week, read the TIPO consultation manual posted on Moodle, watch the video lecture on CRM players. In week 3, quiz 2 is due, and also watch the TCP video that if you haven't done so already.